All right, checking back in with you, class. Today there were just a few things I didn't get to at the end of my comments on the early nation states and how they rather effectively, and actually mostly due to the efforts of relatively small, we can describe them as elites of the political economy. So these could be members of the bourgeoisie of the young industrializing nation states, or members of the traditional aristocracy, but through their effective blending of nationalism, imperialism, and industrialization, they in many ways guide the project of the modern nation states. And in the case of Western Europe, these nation states are going to become, almost without exception, the undisputed heavyweight champs of the new modern industrial global order. So I decided to start here just because we didn't have quite as much time in class to go through some of the key aspects of the Opium Wars, which we used as sort of our microcosm of changes that were happening between East and West in the mid-19th century. And so I'm just going to click through some of these things, and you can stop and look. You can pause this if you need to. These are some of the, in a roundabout way, answers to the questions that were on your discussion guides during yesterday's activity. And I won't comment on these because I'll just leave them to be answered by you. I know I'll get bogged down and take longer than we have here. Just want this to be a short, simple update. We talked about extraterritoriality in class today, as well as the Canton system. So, all right. The SNAP assessment, we can click through that. Today's objective, here we go. And I'm just going to click through this. So we're looking at the who, the what, and the why. Talked about these nation states, Western Europe, to a lesser extent, Japan. Talked about what they accomplished. Talked a little bit about the project and what it means, what we mean by the term nation, and how that term becomes wed or married to the term state, so that a nation and a state becomes a political entity. And the effort here, of course, is to create stable political communities that educate a hopefully well-prepared populace, and also prepare that populace to take steps on behalf of the nation state. And of course, military service is a great example of that. People don't normally risk their lives just to go engage in some sort of empty exercise. So the fact that we have militaries throughout the world today that are willing to take tremendous risks on behalf of their nation state suggests that this concept of nation state is one that's been developed to a significant degree. And then I also mentioned how nationalism doesn't happen by accident, and that there have been some conscious efforts, some of them as part of our school systems, saying the pledge, learning patriotic songs, honoring certain holidays like Veterans Day and Memorial Day, taking moments of silence for different events and developments. And then I also, I guess, should include the institution of the NFL and how it has a pretty close relationship with the U.S. military, and together they sort of promote one another as part of their brand, respective brands. We may not really think much of this, but that is a clearly orchestrated and intentional effort to create a sense of nation-state identity, and to disseminate and instill within the people, in this case of our nation state, the United States, a sense of sacrifice and duty, so forth. Okay. We left off today, we had gotten through most of this slide, and again, just revisiting that notion of the core versus the periphery, the nation versus the empire. In most nation states that engage in imperialism, part of what sets an empire apart from a nation state is an empire normally has a periphery, and in that periphery, well beyond the core, normally the people that live or reside in that periphery do not enjoy the same rights and privileges and benefits of citizenship that are a part of those who live in the core. So I'll leave it at that. All right, finally, I want to close with some comments that should round out our review guide. So Charles Darwin comes along and becomes a really popular, or I should say a strong figure, a strong presence in the mid-19th century. And interestingly enough, he's writing about the same time as a couple other really important authors and thinkers of the mid-19th century. One that we've covered already fairly well, Karl Marx, and another one that we haven't, Sigmund Freud, a really important contributor to the discipline, the field of psychology. I won't get into Freud, but Charles Darwin is a really important part of this time. He publishes, after extensive study of mostly birds in the Galapagos Islands off the coast of modern-day Ecuador. And based on his findings, he publishes a book called The Origin of Species. And this is a real game changer of the mid-19th century that has not only scientific significance, but it winds up having ripples of social significance as well, because it's sort of a little bit, you could almost argue it's a little bit like Copernicus, in the sense that his heliocentric model of the universe had some far-reaching effects that changed the way in which people thought about themselves and their relationship to the universe in which they lived. Similarly, with Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, largely because of the principle of natural selection. So people had known about the theory of evolution for decades before The Origin of Species was published. The big breakthrough here is that Charles Darwin puts forth a mechanism to explain that theory of evolution that had been put forth before. And so natural selection is, you know, I wish I could define it a little bit more succinctly, but essentially this notion that all mammals have distinct traits, but within a species, usually those traits tend to be quite uniform and consistent, although every so often, just like in the human species, there are traits that are a little different. And the theory of natural selection is that when traits emerge, if those traits are advantageous, the nature will show a preference for advantageous traits. And advantageous traits of a species are those traits that allow a member of a species to compete more successfully vis-a-vis or relative to their fellow members of the species. So natural selection over time, over multiple generations of a species, gives rise to a species that is better and better qualified to compete within the world around it. And this gives, you know, a powerful answer to how species, and particularly the human species, has come to be as it is at this moment in the modern world. Now, what becomes really important is not just, you know, Charles Darwin was putting forth a scientific explanation that applied to all species, but what's remarkable here as far as our conversation about imperialism and the nation states of the West versus the societies of the developing world around it, is that it gives way to this really unfounded principle notion that we can call social Darwinism, because the people of the Western nation states, as they interacted with more and more parts of the developing world through their imperial projects of claiming land, claiming the resources of that land, a justification emerges for why Western Europeans and those nation states should have a rightful claim to lands that are essentially not theirs, that are already inhabited. And so social Darwinism becomes this explanation that essentially some groups of people, and they would have used the term back then, some air quote races of people are better qualified. Just like some members of a species, according to Charles Darwin's theory of, mechanism of natural selection in his book Origin of Species, just like some members of a species can outcompete others, such is true, according to the social Darwinists, that certain races or groups of people can outperform their counterparts. And so this gives way to notions of racial and cultural superiority, which becomes something of a justification for the imperialism that's taking place at this time. And with that, I will stop.